Hi, this is Vijaya Atluru for Abiding Grace podcast. Today we will see God's rest for humanity as a gift. In Genesis, second chapter, verses 2 to 3, by the seventh day God finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. The seventh day doesn't have the usual closing refrain. Evening and morning became the next day, till 6 days it says. But on the seventh day there is no termination refrain there. So theologically, it signifies that it is an unending or it is an ongoing rest God intended for creation. Creation was done from chaos, formlessness, void, darkness, and there was nothingness. So out of that God brings order, beauty, and awesomeness and the purpose into the creation. And he gives Adam the purpose, that purpose to carry on the dominion over the creation, to keep the order. And he also blesses them to be fruitful and multiply. God invites the mankind, the first mankind, Adam and Eve, into his presence, as we see implied in the pages of the Bible in Genesis early chapters, that they had communion with God. What was that communion like? It's like an enjoyment, reflection over the awesomeness of creation, being thankful in the presence of God for the gift of grace that he gave, to be participant in that creation and to tend the garden and to enjoy the fruit of the garden. It's a relational communion with God that brought rest to Adam and Eve, and also the ability to keep the mission of having a dominion over the creation. Till he broke the command, he enjoyed that communion. It was a Sabbath for him, the rest. Rest is like having security, safety, and peace and enjoyment, which God brought out of nothingness and chaos, bringing order, safety, security, and enjoyment. Thus, the peace in that relationship with God was rest for Adam. When he fell from God's communion because of his disobedience, he lost the rest. It became a toil, and it became the labor to the woman and the man. And the fruitfulness was not as it was before. It took a lot of toil, and the thorns and the thistles grew out of the ground, in the sweat on the brow. The rest was diminished or eclipsed, and along with the communion with the relational God. So the proximity of God's presence was removed from him. But God did not abandon Adam and Eve. He gave his presence through symbols, through worship, through sacrifices, in the hiddenness rather than the immediate proximity. The holy God and the sinful man, the communion could not go, because the holy God has this blazing eyes of fire where sin cannot stand in his presence. So God's communion was given in symbols, through altars, through sacrifices, in the hiddenness. And the next time we see about the Sabbath is during Israelites. Sabbath is the word that comes from the Hebrew root word Shabbat, that is actually seventh day and rest, both are connected. This seventh day concept was inbuilt in the Old Testament. So they used to call sevening when they took oaths or made contracts, even amongst the community, in the community. So Sabbath is a word derived from the root word Shabbat, that is 7. So seventh and creation and the rest, and all those are interconnected. Though we don't hear the word Sabbath till the newly formed Israelite community was given that command, or a sign of the covenant was given, but we kind of see from Adam to Israel, there is something implied in it. Because during Noah's time, the whole world, the whole earth was again grieving to God. And it became every thought and every intent of every thought was evil continually. So it was not good for sustenance, to ongoing creational activity. So God had to destroy what has gone wrong, and saving only Noah and his family and the pairs of every living creature. If we see, it is again a kind of new creation, though not a different new creation. It is out of the remnant of the good creation, a new creation started. Noah built an altar, and God smelt the sacrifice that Noah gave, and he said that the seasons will not cease, and I will not destroy the earth again. It's not God changing the mind, God respecting a man standing in the gap for the creation. In Noah, being obedient to God makes him righteous, and so he stood in the gap. That only takes us again forward into the Bible. Jesus Christ would be the one who stood in the gap for the fallen humanity to restore the creation in the pages of Revelation, depicted by Isaiah and Jeremiah, in a sense that the new creation would come, where there would be peace between the animals and the little child and the cobra and the child, and the fruitfulness is depicting the future new creation in the Revelation. And again, in Abraham's time, God calls after the Babel chaos, where humanity again gone bad after Noah's story. So God had to scatter the humanity with a bad purpose which would not go in line with God. Humanity has been seeking not to have an authority over them. That has been the temptation from the Garden of Eden till into the New Testament pages also, where they did not want an authority. They themselves want to be autonomous community which would not exist. It's like can a man exist without a head? Can a man exist or live without a heart? That's what it sounded like. So God destroyed and scattered at the Babel the purpose of man again in chapter 11 of Genesis, and chooses Abraham as his a new man to continue creation and to continue to bring the purpose out of the creation, the purpose that he originally intended in the creation, that it would not end, there would not be any termination for the rest. In a sense, God creates again a new, the seed that he promised, because Abraham and Sarah were barren. Out of barrenness, he creates. See the connection, the theme, the out of barrenness in Genesis 1st chapter, out of nothingness God creates. Again, during Noah, he had to create out of, in a sense, out of the same creation, but in a sense, it's an all new creation. And again, in Abraham's life, with Sarah and Abraham having been barren, he had to create anew. It is his work, as it said in Genesis chapter 2. His work. It is his work. Only his work brings life, and only his work brings purpose and the sustenance to take all the way into the pages of Revelation as a new creation, new earth and new heaven, it speaks of the realities of communion between God and church as a redeemed community. So coming to Israelites, when Israel was under the bondage of Egypt, they cried to God and God redeems them. When He redeemed them, He gives a sign of the covenant. In Deuteronomy 5th chapter, if you see from verse 12, He says, keep the Sabbath. So Sabbath, the fourth commandment, as a sign of the covenant. In verse 15 of Deuteronomy 5th chapter, it reads, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you from there by a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, to belong to Him. So the freedom God gives is not a total autonomous freedom, but a change of authority. So God brought Israelites, oppressed Israelites, laboring, toiling, mourning, groaning Israelites from under the authority of Pharaoh, who was a tyrant, who was a ruthless authority, to under the authority of God, who's kind, who's gracious, who thinks the best for the humanity, and whose purposes would prevail. So Israelites were brought from Pharaoh to God. The change of authority took place, which was the freedom and rest. And He promises them rest. And He promises them to go with them to the land of promise. In Deuteronomy 12th chapter 10th verse, He says, He promised the land. In Exodus 33rd chapter 33, verse 14, His presence would go with them to give them rest. So His presence and His authority were the rest for Israelites. And He promised them a land of rest. If you see in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23, the land is God's land. So Israelites were to find rest in communion with God in the land that belonged to Him, with His presence amongst the Israelites. In communion with Him again, the rest take place, as was with Adam. In Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, a beautiful verse, God says, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell amongst you. God, as the sole sovereign authority over this newly redeemed community of Israelites, living amongst them as their Lord, and the people obeying Him and trusting Him in His provision, in His lordship, in that relational communion in the tabernacle, was the rest. So we see that relational communion is the only form of rest. It's not just the cessation of activity, it is the relational communion with God. Setting apart a day, a week, in a week, and an year in 7 years, and 7 sevens again a Jubilee year, were inbuilt into that Israelite community as rest from slavery, from debts, because God ordered them that to release the slaves once in 7 years and in Jubilee, and cancel the debts, and the land that was sold could be brought back to the original owner. So he gave this civil law, and the rest is inbuilt in sevens. What is rest then? Release from power, release from slavery, release from a debt, release from bankruptcy. That's the kind of rest God was building into their institution, into their community, into their kingdom. But rest was spoiled again because of their disobedience and lack of trust. During the wilderness journey, as God was walking before them, or God was present with them in the form of pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, guiding them as a pilot, He gave them rest from time to time, and He gave them rest in His presence. Even during the time of man, in Exodus 16th chapter, God told them not to gather manna on the seventh day. The inbuilt disobedient inclination of humanity was there in them. Some of them went and looked for manna on the seventh day. And in the land of Israel, again in the promised land, their Sabbath became a ritual rather than a relational communion with God. They were breaking the Sabbath without legally breaking it. When they were to travel some distance, which was beyond the traditionally distance that the society came up with in the ordinances, they used to put a toothbrush at every mile, so that the toothbrush was a kind of a symbol of their dwelling place. So they would travel from mile to mile, from toothbrush to toothbrush, to finish whatever work they wanted to do. Sabbath became such a ritual and a burden on them that they were trying to find ways to break it. It was no longer a communion with God, but another ordinance for them as a chore. Only check boxes without substance. So it was carried on throughout the history of Israelites, where God was sending prophets to rebuke them because of their disobedience. During the time of Jeremiah, God sends Jeremiah to rebuke them that they were breaking the Sabbath and not giving rest to the land which belonged to Him. And they were harvesting whole 7 years without giving the rest on the seventh year. So Jeremiah prophesies even before it happened. In chapter 4, verses 23 to 26, I beheld the earth, lo, it was without form and it was void. So Jeremiah foresees how the land was to become because of their disobedience of breaking the ordinance of Sabbath as a covenant sign. The sign of the covenant was, I am the Lord, you are my people, you depend on me, you trust in me, you obey me, and I will bless you, I will prosper you, I will take you as my people, and you will be the priests and the representatives of my essence to all other people in the whole world. That was the sign of the covenant, that they would become equipped to present the Lord and His essence and the essence of his being to the people of the world to display who God is. And they failed. So, because of the failure of Israelites in keeping that obedience, they were driven into captivity again under the king of Babylon, which they refused, they resisted. All they wanted was the tabernacle and the temple, not God in that tabernacle. So idolatry was inbuilt into the ideas of humanity, not obedience and trust. Humanity has been replacing communion with the living God and obeying Him and trusting Him with the symbols as idols, where there is no obedience is needed, only a fancy trust that that object would protect them. That was the life of Israelites. They thought having a temple in their midst would be their security, safety, order, peace, and rest. While they were disobeying God in the land which belonged to Him, they were tenants in the land of God. That has been the legacy of humanity till today, like replacing the living God with the objects. Coming from Hinduism, I know idolatry is very seductive in a sense, because it seems like we are in charge. We are not uncertain. We are not under somebody else's. So we desire and we ask those idols, thinking that it would run by offering some bribes and offerings. In the pages of New Testament, God has to come as human, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who would be the perfect man and take us to God to have rest in that communion. I will stop here and take the subject in part 2. I respect your time, and that time is precious. I do not want to do more than 25 to 30 minutes in each podcast. We'll pick the topic in the second part of God's rest. God bless you.